Hey everyone, this is Pete, and I've said numerous times recently that the adventure game has been enjoying a real period of prosperity recently. At this point, I'm perfectly happy to go on record and say that in fact the genre is healthier and better off today than it ever was back in the Sierra and LucasArts heyday. And nowhere is this more apparent than with games like Old Skies. Old Skies is the latest game to be developed in-house by Wadjet Eye Games, an adventure game specialist developer-publisher that first came to the attention of many with its adventure game studio-powered point-and-clicker, The Shiver, back in 2006. Since that relatively humble beginning, Wadjet Eye has built itself up to be a leading name in the genre, with a significant number of excellent titles to its name, both as a developer and a publisher. Old Skies is a significant title for Wadjet Eye though. It's one of the company's most ambitious and lengthy adventures, and it released, quite understandably, to critical acclaim. So let's take a closer look at it today. In Old Skies, you take on the role of Fia Quinn, an agent for an organisation known as Chronozen. Chronozen specialises in commercial time travel, allowing those with the money to pay for its services the opportunity to step back into the past for a nostalgia trip, or in some cases, even to manipulate the past so their present puts them in a more advantageous position. As you might expect, this leads to all manner of paradoxes and changes to the present, depending on what Chronozen agents and their clients are doing all over the world. But Old Skies takes great care to set up its lore to explain all this. Following the establishment of Chronozen, it argues, every individual in the world was recorded in an archive and given a timeline importance ranking. Those deemed to be of low importance that a timeline could be interacted with by Chronozen agents and their clients to such a degree that it would have a noticeable impact on the future, while those considered to be of high importance were considered to be mostly off limits. The upshot of a world that plays fairly fast and loose with the sanctity of history, at least with regard to those considered to be of lower importance to humanity as a whole, is that the present day of Old Skies frequently suffers a phenomenon known as chronoshifts, where a purple wave sweeps across the world, changing or even removing things in its wake as a result of something being changed in the past, and the effects of that rippling outwards. Consequently, most people aware of this fact, mostly Chronozen agents, have developed a philosophy where it makes sense not to get too attached to anything that hasn't been chronolocked, or engineered to not be affected by these shifts. Indeed, one suspects that the setting's replacement of the traditional term family or relationship with the rather clinical term cluster, presumably brought about with the good intentions of including non-nuclear family units such as those based on polyamory or those with no intention of bringing children into the world, stems from this fact. A cluster feels like something it will be a lot easier to let go of than a family should the situation demand it. All this is, as you might expect, a core theme of Old Skies. If nothing is permanent, then what is real? Are you even real? Indeed, a major plot point that extends throughout the game concerns several individuals keeping track of their alternate selves using a futuristic take on social media, and coming to terms with how to feel about yourself having a completely different existence to the one you know. Or, in more extreme cases, having died, or maybe having never even existed at all. This is something that the protagonist, Fia, wrestles with throughout the game. The very first assignment we accompany her on sees her having to kill her client because he broke the rules of time travel by attempting to prevent an event with high importance to the timeline. Focus on the job is the mantra that is being drilled into Fia by her mentor, but as time goes on this becomes increasingly challenging, particularly as she starts to wonder if her own existence will ever really leave a mark on the world. Will there ever be any proof that she existed once she is gone? Or is she just smothering her own identity and legacy with corporate protocol? This concept is explored over the course of Fia's subsequent missions, which initially appear to be unrelated incidents, but which later turn out to be interconnected. Fia's recognition of this connection, along with her part in helping to assemble the story that unfolds, leads her to crave something more, a life with more meaning, a life with a legacy. The thing that proves most difficult for her is an incident where she does finally receive what appears to be permanent recognition for her contributions in the form of a portrait painted by an individual whose life she touched. But this, like so many other things, ends up snatched away from her by a chronoshift, and this marks a bit of a breaking point for our leading lady, with everything from this point on marked by a distinct sense of regret and dissatisfaction on Fia's part. In many respects, Old Skies is a game about grief. It's a game about regrets and wishing things might have gone differently. Indeed, Fia and her colleagues discuss how their recruitment to Chronozen was sold to them as having the opportunity to see all the paths not taken. What no one told them at the time, of course, was that the paths not taken they would be seeing would not be their own, but rather those of their clients. Of course, being able to do it all over again is no guarantee that one will be able to make things better. Indeed, in the case of one of Fia's clients, their jaunt back into the past makes the client's life in the present significantly worse as a result of the things Fia inadvertently uncovers during her investigation. The client ends up ultimately more honest about her past, but there's no way in which that has made her life in any way better as a result. Over the course of her travels, Fia comes to develop feelings for an individual she encounters in a number of different contexts and time periods. The stronger these feelings become, helped along by the fact that the pair of them encounter multiple crises at various different times, up to and including the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, the more Fia feels dissatisfied with her current existence, effectively outside of time, manipulating the pasts and legacies of others while neglecting herself and her own happiness. As you might expect, all this builds to a dramatic conclusion where Fia ends up taking some significant chances that she won't be able to undo. In a way, Fia's eventual fate is tragic, but from another perspective it's uplifting. She takes control of her life, reaches out for the existence she wants, and grabs hold of it. She runs the risk of ending up as someone who had never existed in the first place, and the final shot of the game leaves that fact a little ambiguous depending on how you interpret it. But in doing so, she will have lived her life not as a slave to corporate protocol, but as someone who is truly free. It is in many ways fitting that for the game's finale sequence, the perspective actually shifts away from Fia, so there are several things that happen off-screen, and we never get complete closure on how those things unfolded. These last moments coincide with Fia breaking free from the control of Chronozen and her invisible, meaningless existence in the game's present day, and thus it makes sense that she has the freedom to do those things in privacy, away from the prying eyes of both Chronozen and the player. But I'll leave the details of that for you to discover and interpret for yourself. Mechanically speaking, Old Skies is streamlined and effective. Unusually, descriptive phrases for unimportant objects are displayed as tooltips while sweeping the mouse cursor over the environment, rather than triggering dialogue or narration. This might be initially a bit jarring for those who are used to adventure game protagonists having a pithy comment to say for every hotspot on screen, but it works well. It helps keep the focus on the truly important things, while still providing scope for some witty, descriptive text at times. The game makes use of a single-click interface, where the cursor changes its icon according to the hotspot you're over, a magnifying glass for the aforementioned descriptive text, a speech bubble for speaking with characters, and a hand icon for interacting with or picking up objects. Inventory manipulation is simple. Clicking on an inventory item turns it into a cursor in cases where the object can potentially be used on something in the environment, or another inventory item, while objects that are purely there to be examined more closely, or used by themselves, will call up a close-up image or prompt a comment from Fia when clicking on them. By genre standards, Old Skies puzzles are fairly gentle, at least in part due to this straightforward interface, and in cases where you do find yourself struggling, you can usually contact Fia's handler, Nozzo, to get a hint on what you should do next. It's unlikely you'll ever find yourself in a situation where you absolutely cannot progress due to moon logic, and there are no dead man walking situations where you cannot proceed further due to missing an important item or action from an earlier scene you can no longer return to. You can die in Old Skies, however, but this doesn't mean the end of the game or having to restore a saved game. Instead, Fia being put in mortal peril, or suffering outright fatal injuries, triggers the emergency rewind protocol, which spools time back just long enough for Fia to be able to resolve the situation without suffering fatal consequences this time. Indeed, there are some situations later in the game that outright require several rewinds to resolve, with an important part of the process being the discovery of a way to successfully carry items over from one loop to the next. All this has caused some to consider Old Skies to be too easy, but I can't agree on that point. Given the length of the game, about 15 hours for a first playthrough, which is long for an adventure game, it's clear that the emphasis here was always intended to be the narrative, and thus it makes little sense to arbitrarily hold the player up with things that will bring the unfolding story to a screeching halt. There's no padding, in other words. There are plenty of convoluted situations that one would only see in an adventure game, rather than in a non-interactive narrative such as a movie or book, but none of them feel like they're standing in the way of the story's progression. They are instead a natural part of that story's progression. Presentation-wise, Old Skies is beautiful. Ben Chandler's spectacular backdrops are truly evocative of each of the historical eras Fia travels back to, and present a convincing view of the near future in the present day segments. Particularly worthy of note is how well each scene is lit. There's a real sense of atmosphere, and a sense that the time of day each story beat is presented during has been chosen very deliberately. On top of that, some excellent character design, featuring some well-considered costume choices for each time period, really helps sell the time travel fantasy. Characters are well animated, and the lip syncing is particularly excellent, using what appears to be a similar tech seen in later LucasArts titles such as Day of the Tentacle and Full Throttle. My only minor nitpick with the visual side of things would be that during some of the close-up character scenes, certain characters, including Fia, look markedly more aged than they do during regular gameplay. Although given that a key part of the setting involves characters receiving regular injections to increase their longevity, leading to many people being a lot older than they actually look when measured by today's standards, one could argue that this was perhaps a deliberate stylistic choice. The music is fantastic, with a clear leitmotif running through the entire game, coming to the fore during particularly noteworthy and emotionally engaging scenes. There's a constant sense of melancholy to the soundtrack, which fits well with Fia's sense of malaise that gradually escalates over the course of the narrative, and the music responds well to the on-screen happenings, with near seamless mixes between tracks. Star of the show presentation-wise has to be the voice acting, however, which is absolutely stellar, with Sally Beaumont's performance as Fia Quinn being a particular highlight. The choice to cast Fia as a very British-sounding woman who lives in New York was, I feel, absolutely deliberate. It provides an interesting sense of juxtaposition between Fia's sense of discontent at being invisible and having no legacy to call her own, and the fact that the very way she sounds immediately makes her stand out as a memorable individual. Indeed, more than one reference is made over the course of the complete narrative to how remarkable it is that Fia has managed to hold on to her accent, after not only living in New York for what appears to be a long time, but also living through numerous chrono shifts and time jumps. In some respects then, Fia's real tragedy is the fact that she is unable to, or unwilling to, recognise herself as a unique individual who absolutely does have her own legacy and impact on the world. But at the same time, her viewpoint is understandable. Her sense of malaise is the natural extension of today's constant vying for attention and affirmation online. The feeling that unless you have something concrete to show that you matter somehow, even if that something is as vapid and fleeting as a like counter, or the amount of ad revenue one manages to secure from a page or video view, then you are invisible, meaningless, worthless. Through its time travel sequences, the game also takes care to highlight changing attitudes over time, such as a black character indicating that they anticipate they might have to contend with certain prejudices when travelling back to the 1930s, and an Asian character struggling for recognition in New York around the turn of the millennium. The game by no means loses focus by battering players over the head with socio-political statements at any point, but these issues are important to acknowledge in a narrative like this, particularly when, in several cases, those issues explain the way some characters end up behaving or responding to situations. The world Fia lives in is clearly one that has, in some ways, learned to be a lot more inclusive and accepting than the one we live in today, particularly with regard to matters of race, gender and sexuality. But at the same time, it's also one that feels a lot more impersonal. Given that in Fia's present, history is effectively controlled by a corporate monopoly, it's a little surprised that some people feel a sense of dissatisfaction at the inherent impermanence of everything, and the constant sense that anything meaningful you might achieve could be wiped out and completely forgotten by the vast majority of the world at a moment's notice. One thing's for sure though, I'm not going to be forgetting Fia's journey in a hurry. Old Skies is one of the finest adventure games I've ever had the pleasure of playing, and proof if proof were needed at this point, the Wadjet Eye Games are absolute masters of their craft. I don't think it really needs to be said at this point, but adventure game fans have never had it as good as they do today. The Sierra and LucasArts heyday will always be special, absolutely. But I think we've reached a point where the modern day adventure game has far exceeded anything the supposed golden age ever put out. And, as someone who's always considered Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis to be one of his all-time favourite games, that's not something I say lightly. Go buy Old Skies, play it, love it, and you'll understand. And so it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.